There was a long period of time for the Digimon franchise where a lot of its games either weren't all that great or they weren't newcomer friendly, and sometimes they were both things at once. If you were wanting to get into Digimon, while you might still have enjoyed the games, they were by no means the first place you should go to. The anime was a much better place to start with when getting into the franchise. This started to change a bit, however, after Kazumasa Habu became one of the main producers for the Digimon games. Not only did they start becoming more newcomer friendly, but the actual quality for them was higher as well, with all of this culminating in the release of Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth. Released in Japan in 2015 and almost a year later for the rest of the world, Cyber Sleuth is a reboot for the story series that started with what we in the West would know as Digimon World DS, and it would eventually become the series' current best-selling game by a fairly wide margin. By itself, it sold 800,000 copies, and for context, the previous best-selling game before it, as far as I can tell, was with the PS1's Digimon World at 250,000 copies. So yeah, needless to say, this was a pretty big jump in sales, and it's not hard to see why. The game was marketed and made for an older demographic in mind after the team noticed how old most of the audience watching Digimon Cross Wars actually was. The higher production values along with the more fine-tuned gameplay and the more interesting story made for a better overall game than previous ones, and it made Cyber Sleuth easier to get into compared to previous Digimon games. Let me tell ya, I was pretty hyped for Cyber Sleuth when I first saw the trailer. As a fan of the franchise in the mid-2010s, getting a Digimon game at all was exciting enough, but getting one that looked as good as it did was a pretty great feeling. Honestly, I've been wanting to talk about this game for a while now, but I've been waiting for Digimon Story 6 to get an actual trailer and release date first, and with neither of those anywhere in sight years later, I've gotten really tired of waiting, so without further ado, let's finally get into my current favorite game in the franchise. Cyber Sleuth takes place in a mostly modern-day Tokyo, with the key difference being Eden, a cyberspace created by Kamishiro Enterprises that people can mentally transport avatar versions of themselves to, with Eden functioning similarly to the internet. One day, while our main character, who I'll be referring to as Ami since I chose the girl option, was in a chat room, a hacker looking like Eden's mascot, Mr. Navit, barged in and promised everyone a gift if they logged into Eden the next day, with the caveat being he'd hack them if they didn't. Unfortunately for them, though, this would require them to visit an area of Kowloon called Galacta Park, with Kowloon being an area of Eden where programs called Digimon live and hackers thrive. This ultimately resulted in all of them being forcefully given the Digimon Capture app, Ami getting a starter Digimon from a hacker named Yugo, and Ami also getting her brain data munched on by a cybernetic monochrome mollusk called an Eater, so not exactly the best day for her. Normally, this would have resulted in Ami getting Eden Syndrome, a disease where people who went to Eden fall into a coma after being attacked. But somehow, the Eater only got part of her data, so while her human body did fall into a coma, she gets logged out of Eden with a half-cyber body. Shortly after that, Ami's taken in by Kyoko Kuremi, a cyber sleuth that investigates all kinds of weird cases as well as cyber crimes, and is fascinated by Ami's situation. So she also takes her on as an assistant while they investigate, since she's been looking for one anyway. Oh, and in regards to the starter Digimon, since I kinda glossed over it, I wouldn't worry too much about which to choose. Terriermon, Haguremon, and Palmon are all obtainable normally, so don't worry about not being able to get the other ones. I just pick whichever one you like the most. The story of Digimon Cyber Sleuth, like I said before, has more depth compared to the games that came before it, and was written for an older audience in mind, and honestly, looking back at the game 8 years later and having played Digimon Survive, handling it this way was definitely a good call. While I don't think Digimon stories in any way need to be consistently really dark or even adult at all, I feel like they're at their best when they're not afraid to weave in some more dark or mature themes every now and then, like with Digimon Tamers, which is honestly just one of my favorite seasons of the anime. In fact, it's kinda interesting I bring up Tamers, because the Eaters kinda feel like they were inspired by an antagonist from that season, who for spoiler reasons I won't name, but I gotta say, I do actually prefer said villain. Here's the thing with the Eaters. While I really like how they're used in the story, as well as the stakes they set up for the plot with Eden Syndrome, I don't think Cyber Sleuth focuses on them quite enough. They show up enough so that they always feel like a constant threat, but the mysteries surrounding them aren't given a ton of spotlight until close to the end of the game. The other aspects of the story definitely keep things interesting, mind you, but with how important to the whole plot the Eaters are, I do wish they were handled a bit better. On a sort of related note though, I also wish there was a bit more diversity with their designs. While I do love how unnatural and even kinda wrong they look, for the normal Eaters we only really have 2 designs, and I feel like they should have had a couple more. Getting back on track though, this does kinda tie in with one of my other criticisms with Cyber Sleuth's story, with its pacing, but for some important context, let's dive into the game's story structure real quick. Ami, being Kyoko's new assistant detective, will have to earn their keep while they're staying at the agency, so you'll be solving cases of all different kinds for clients, and not all of them will be story relevant. So positives first here, I do really like or even love a vast majority of the cases in the game. Plenty of them are charming, interesting, or both, and they're not usually long at all. Like, at most, assuming the case in question isn't super story relevant, it usually won't take you more than 35, maybe 40 minutes to do one. My personal favorite cases in the game are the parallel world quests, both for the boss fights and the very appreciated Digimon World Dusk fan service with Sayo being here, and Living Doll's Dead Person, because Jesus Christ, this case is a tone shift. This case involves you helping out some girls from the occult club when a company named Jirogumo starts selling hyper-realistic and somehow hyper-accurate life-size dolls of them and other women to people without their consent. Now, that on its own would be super creepy and disturbing enough, but oh, trust me, it gets worse. Like, this case is arguably darker and more messed up than most of Digimon Survive worse. I won't go deeper into it because I don't dare spoil it for those who haven't seen it yet, but trust me, you aren't ready for this part of the game. I will say though, playing the game as a girl does make this one scene during this case kinda weird and even funny, with this doll seller walking up to Ami and just assuming she's into women, because I guess something about her just radiates sapphic energy. The trade-off to all of this, though, is that there will be plenty of times where the pacing of the game will be slowed down to allow for some more mandatory cases that may or may not be relevant to the actual plot. And while I don't personally mind it too much, I wouldn't blame anyone else for being a bit annoyed by this, especially if you're really invested in the game's overarching mysteries. With that being said though, one of my favorite aspects of Cyber Sleuth's story is definitely with its main cast. Nokia and Arata have some great chemistry with one another as friends, and the case where you take them to various restaurants in Nakano to review their food is pretty great. Being real for a sec though, Nokia might be my personal favorite character in the game. I've always loved really positive or optimistic characters, but I also really like her relationship with Agumon and Gabumon. It's kinda wholesome and they easily have one of my favorite scenes in the whole game. Yuko, the daughter of Kamishiro Enterprises founder, is a pretty interesting character who, for reasons I can't go into, is tied with Kyoko as my second favorite character in the game, and honestly, straight up has my favorite character design in the whole game. I can't go into Kyoko too much for similar reasons to Yuko, but I will say that I loved the jokes with her coffee. How she can like some of the blends she makes is beyond me, but it does make for some funny reactions when she gets people to actually drink it. With all of that in mind though, my biggest criticism for the story as a whole is with the player character, because honestly, I feel like the devs couldn't fully decide on how exactly to handle them. They're treated like a silent protagonist, with you picking dialogue options for them, with Ami silently talking to other people when needed, but there's a good few moments where we get their direct commentary on something anyway. The whole thing is just kinda awkwardly handled, and as far as Ami being a silent protagonist goes, I've definitely seen better, with Nokia, strangely and funnily enough, putting it best herself in this scene at the K Cafe. As a whole though, I do really like Cyber Sleuth's story. For the Digimon game's first time telling a deeper and more complex plot, I think it was a pretty good first attempt, with it having a pretty lovable main cast, and it helps set an exciting precedent for future stories in this part of the franchise. Before we get to the gameplay though, I of course gotta talk about the presentation, and even 8 years later, I think it still looks pretty good. Tokyo looks nice enough, but Eden and Kowloon are visually my favorite sections of the game, with Eden reminding me a lot of the internet cyberspace from the Digimon movie Our War Game, and Kowloon just looking very pleasing to me. I also have to give some praise for the game's character designs, courtesy of Suzuhito Yasuda, who you might know from the Devil Survivor games or the anime Durarara. I've always been a big fan of his art style as well as character designs, and I think he did a great job with almost everyone, aside from Kyoko, whose design I'd feel way better about if she just had an actual pair of pants instead of the booty shorts. While this next note sorta touches on the gameplay side of things, if I did have one criticism for the presentation, it's how visually repetitive the dungeons can get. The digital shift dungeons are fine, but anything else just feels boring or samey in its layout and design after a while. Heck, they even copy and paste some of them for a few side quests. I'm willing to cut the devs some slack though, since honestly this could have easily just been a budget issue. That being said though, the soundtrack is definitely my favorite part of the presentation. The game's soundtrack was composed by Masafumi Takeda, who's also composed for No More Heroes and Danganronpa, and his work in Cyber Sleuth is just as good as it is in those other games, with some of my favorite songs being the title screen theme, Raging Tide, and the final boss's theme. Getting to the actual gameplay though, Digimon Cyber Sleuth plays just like the other story games, with it being a turn-based RPG where you can have up to 3 Digimon out in battle at a time, with your 3 frontrunners also following you around in the field, which is just a nice touch. You can take a whopping 11 Digimon with you, but how many you can bring will be limited based on your max party memory, with each Digimon taking up a certain amount of it, with their memory cost getting more and more expensive as they digivolve to higher levels. This can be increased by using memory ups though, which you can get from cases, certain boss fights, and in chests. This is actually important for reasons outside of combat with Ami's hacker skills. These are abilities she can use with the help of her Digimon, with them requiring you to have a certain amount and level of Digimon to use based on the skill in question and the level. Now, in concept, I really like the idea of the hacker skills, what with Digimon being creatures made of data and all, but in execution, I find it a little underutilized. Function Call is great for grinding since it forces an encounter, and High Security is also great since it reduces and even prevents random encounters at level 3. But aside from them, all we have left are the basic abilities like Code Scan, Copy and Paste, Stealth Hide, and Wall Break. And while I don't have a problem with them, aside from Copy and Paste since it's rarely used, I wish there were some more interesting abilities here. That being said though, let's get to something a bit more interesting with Cyber Sleuth's actual combat. Like I said before, the game is turn-based, with each Digimon getting 1 action per turn, and who goes next being shown by the turn order gauge. Each Digimon also has a type and an elemental attribute to keep track of, which will grant them resistances and damage bonuses for whatever they're strong or weak against. Along with basic things like normal attacks and guarding, every Digimon can have a max pool of 20 skills they can use, which can of course range from moves that debuff enemies, buff you or the party, heal, and of course deal damage. But only 6 of them will be usable in a fight. Digimon will learn new skills as they level up like you'd expect, but with the exception of their signature move, they'll also retain anything they learned when they evolve or devolve, which honestly I really like since it can get you some pretty diverse move pools thanks to how Digivolution works. Something interesting Cyber Sleuth does with its combat though is with cross combos. These do a few different things depending on what the combo triggers for, with the effects ranging from extra damage to increased healing. Now, when a cross combo actually goes off and how many Digimon participate, though, is luck-based, with it being determined by how high each Digimon's combo gauge is and how high their cam stat is, with that maxing out at 100. With all of that being said though, while I do really enjoy the combat for Cyber Sleuth, I'm not gonna lie, I feel like there's a strong argument that it's objectively too easy on normal. Getting overleveled or even just overpowered thanks to Digivolution for normal encounters isn't too hard at all, and honestly in the case with a number of bosses, I think they could have stood to just be a little stronger, or just have mooks or skills who can buff them or draw your attention in the case of the former. Now, let me be clear, I don't need the game to be super difficult at all. I do still really enjoy the gameplay regardless, but I think it really says something when the 7 Demon Lords, basically this game's super bosses from the Parallel World questline, are some of my favorite fights in the game. They still weren't super hard at all, heck, I didn't even lose against them. But there were some pretty close calls, and they actually had strategies and moves I really needed to keep in mind. With a couple exceptions, these were some of the only fights in the game I needed to use some proper strategy for. For those of you who like or even need a decent challenge in your games, playing Cyber Sleuth on hard mode will be a must for you. It gives a pretty nice boost for enemy attack stats as well as health. You even get more money as well as a higher item drop rate as a bonus. Now, with all of that being said though, the thing I love most about the gameplay for Cyber Sleuth, and by extension the Digimon games in general, is how much say you have for how your party progresses. Most monster taming games give you plenty of freedom for specifically how you can build your party, and that applies here as well. But the free-form nature of Digimon evolution gives you so much say in what you can use at any point in time. More often than not, you'll always have multiple different options for what any one Digimon can become next, and you can always devolve if you need to, or if you just want to take a different route. And actually, something important I should go into that I just implied is that you very likely will have to devolve your Digimon at some point. See, for Digimon evolution, it's not as simple as getting to one specific level. You'll have other requirements you'll need to meet, like having some stats be high enough. There is, however, one stat you can only increase by evolving or devolving, barring the use of very rare or expensive items of course, called ABI. With very few exceptions, this will only really come into play once a Digimon's gotten to Ultimate, and the amount of ABI you'll need can be as low as 20 or as high as 120. If you just want a Mega and don't care what form it takes, you'll only need to devolve a Digimon once at best and twice at worst. As a quick tip, when you go to convert data for new Digimon that you scanned in battle, try and wait until they get to 200% charge instead of just 100. Doing this will get them 5 ABI at the start, which will make your life in the long run the littlest bit easier if you want to use them. The ABI stat exists as a way to encourage you to use different Digimon and not just stick to a few specific ones like I did to help get this video out a bit faster. And honestly, I would recommend not playing the game the way I did. You'll definitely have more fun if you use a wide variety of Digimon, and this way you can box party members when needed for certain evolutions while still having a full party. And on that note actually, let's get into the farm island for this game and raising your Digimon outside of combat. But first, we need to talk about the Digilab real quick. Whenever you approach an Eden spot, you'll be able to visit Mirai's Digilab. Here you'll be able to shop for items, heal your party with some money, and you'll also evolve your Digimon here as well as make new ones like I've mentioned before. Now as for the farm island itself, you can move Digimon from your party or Digibank into any farm island you have, and once there all you have to do is leave them to do their thing in the background while you play the game normally. While Digimon are in the farm island, they'll casually gain experience points, and you can even have them make items for you with development, train for bonus stats as they level up, and you can even have them investigate to find special hacker-related cases for Mirai or property cases that are all simple fetch quests. All of these will take varying amounts of time to finish though, with that being determined by the Digimon currently on that island, and they can only do one of these 3 things at any given moment. And do be careful if you're playing the Switch version, because the timer for experience gain doesn't actually stop when the console goes in sleep mode, so you could potentially end up with overpowered Digimon, and you could even use this as a way to get max level megas pretty early in the game with minimal effort. As for one final point to bring up before we end things off, you'll also be able to get messages from any Digimon on the farm island with Digiline, where they ask you questions or even quiz you. You can get messages from other characters in the main story as well, with Mirai even telling you when a task's been completed or when a Digimon's hit max level. Honestly, it's a cute little touch that I kinda hope comes back in later story games. Real talk, while Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth definitely has its fair share of issues and things it could improve on, I really do mean it when I say that this is one of Digimon's greatest games. It's a solid RPG and game all around. The story is nice, the main cast is fun and interesting, Ami aside, and while there's areas where the gameplay could be improved, it's still really fun, and aside from the difficulty, it doesn't really have any major problems that I think hurt the overall experience. This is a game that even non-Digimon fans could still enjoy, and with how well this game ended up doing compared to everything else before it, that's a big deal for this franchise. Cyber Sleuth was the point where the quality of Digimon's games got a noticeable increase, and while the drought for new games can be painful, especially with the wait for Digimon Story 6, what we've gotten since then have been some of the franchise's best games, and as a fan of this franchise, I really couldn't be happier about that. Which is a part of the reason why I'm looking forward to covering Hacker's Memory in the next video, because for a lot of personal reasons I won't get into, I unfortunately never got around to actually playing it at all. So until then, thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and hope you all have a nice day.